So you can start.
Okay, good morning, bom dia a todas e todos. Good morning, Professor Makoni, who is at Penn State College. So this is our second presentation of the day. My name is Cristine Severo. I'm a professor at Federal University of Santa Catarina and at the postgraduate program of linguistics. I've been working with colonial linguistics in former Portuguese and Spanish colonies, critical language policy and planning, and southern epistemologies. So I'm going to present our joint work today. This is the annual conference of the International Association for the Integrational Study of Language and Communication that is being hosted by the postgraduate program of linguistics at the Federal University of Santa Catarina and the research group on critical language policy and planning, together with the International Association for the Integrational Study of Language and Communication. It's my pleasure and to introduce you, our second speaker today, together with me, that is Professor Sinfree Makoni. Professor Sinfree Makoni currently teaches in the Department of Applied Linguistics and Program in African Studies at Pennsylvania State University in the United States. He is an extraordinary professor at the University of Northwest South Africa, and he is also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow at Laikipia University in Kenya. His research is largely into colonial linguistics, language policy and planning, southern epistemologies, and philosophies of language. Some recent books include Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South with Alistair Pennycook, and the Integration of Linguistics and Philosophy of Language in the Global South, edited together with Darren Verity and Ana Marques, Kuiper Marques. So we are going to present today this article, this paper that is about Southern epistemological and indigenous ontological orientations to apply linguistics. How can this challenge its ethnocentrism? I'm going to start sharing our presentation. Makoni, the floor is yours, so you can start presenting, then I just follow you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Cristine, for the invitation. I'm going to present the first part of this paper where we are exploring issues about Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontological orientations to applied linguistics. And after that, Cristine will then take over and explore the relevance of very specific indigenous ontologies to applied linguistics, right? So, okay, let's move on to the objectives. Let's move on to the second slide. Or do you want to translate into Portuguese, Cristine?
Okay. Yes. Então, a gente vai começar a nossa apresentação, que pode ser, né, usando um pouco de translanguaging. Então, podem as perspectivas, né, epistemológicas do sul global e ontológicas, né, baseadas nas epistemologias indígenas, né, nas ontologias indígenas, elas podem problematizar, né, a linguística aplicada, né, é possível que a gente traga, né, essa perspectiva em torno dessa problematização? É um pouco sobre isso que a gente vai falar, né?
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Next slide. We aim to contribute to a development of Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies towards applied linguistics by using as a mechanism what Adrian Pablé and Hutton and Harris would call lay perspectives as analytic heuristics. That notion originates from integrationism. We generally are seeking to argue that Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies render it feasible to decolonize applied linguistics. Right. We must, I think, that is our conviction, problematize core concepts in applied linguistics, such as the notion of language, what constitutes learning, and what constitutes applied linguistics. What is language, we argue, should be a central question instead of engagement in foreclosing the debate. Drawing partially on Hawke and Herrick's work in the Amerindians, who talk about the natures of language. What we're trying to do here, we're trying to challenge frameworks which are universalistic in orientation, that take for granted what is the nature of language. The argument we are making here is that we are advocating for a contextualized applied linguistics. That is a product, we argue, of continuous and ongoing reflection, of individual experimentation and creativity with the local in a decolonizing applied linguistics. We seek to illustrate that Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies render it feasible to move beyond what we think constitutes the current impasse that critical applied linguistics is faced with. This is because, to some extent, critical applied linguistics, in spite of the progress that it might have made, has got itself caught up, cannot escape Eurocentric scholarship. Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies are not the same as critical applied linguistics, because the latter, critical applied linguistics, tends to entrench differences between the global north and the global south, which are the objects of which we seek to challenge in Southern epistemologies. A delinking of the global south, to use McNullo's term, from the global north, we argue, is politically desirable, as we strive to move towards a more egalitarian politics of knowledge production. But we are, however, aware that this might not be feasible due to the entanglement in applied linguistics between the global north and the global south. Neither decolonial thinking nor epistemologies of the south and indigenous ontologies claim to replace a previously incorrect paradigm with a correct one, but rather what we are seeking to provide are paradigms of complexity that, rather than seeking authenticity, seek justice and horizontality. The Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies that we are seeking to develop involve a mobilization of and a construction of assemblages of indigenous and non-Western ontologies of language and multilingualism. We also capitalize on perspectives of marginalized communities in either the global north or the global south. That is, we try and seek to explore what are the lay perspectives of individuals who are on the borders of society. The example that we normally give here is this, is that in terms of Southern epistemologies, if you want to understand what a mortgage is, we argue, is you're better off not asking the banker, but asking somebody who is homeless, because they'll give you a better insight into what it means to own a home. In the epistemological and ontological assemblages, language is not separate from other aspects of one's being that are central to an individual's life, such as their spirituality, because we argue language is life and life is language, which provides spiritual sustenance. Language in this framework is not an abstraction, it is animacy. The most radical position that we are taking here is best captured by Lewis Gordon in his book, 2021, where we argue that Southern epistemologies seek to facilitate a shift in what he calls a geography of reason, which requires shifting our understanding and our imagination and scholarly practices. A shift in the geography of reason requires that we be willing to take a leap of faith across what are at first thought unthinkable, that theories can be created from the global south, thus avoiding epistemic dependency and what we also call epistemic colonization. Southern epistemologies are grounded in political commitment. Political commitment requires acting without knowing the outcome and acting for whom one ultimately will never know who benefits from one's action. No political act offers guarantees except one, that it will affect somebody who you might not know. Thank you. Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies do not constitute a fixed body of knowledge, but rather an emergent set of possibilities. Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies in applied linguistics are multi-centered, and they represent diverse social experiences and conflicting forms of knowledge that may accommodate the needs of social movements, all of which are relevant to democratizing applied linguistics. Yeah, let's move on, Cristine. Such interest, for example, in Southern epistemologies is occurring at the same time that there is a decolonial turn, which is marked by a massive shift in knowledge production comparable to the linguistic and pragmatic turns that were previously witnessed. Although the concept of decolonization is controversial, we can construe it for the purposes of this paper to refer to simply a political and epistemic project that surfaces from local histories elsewhere and otherwise, which seek to speak back to this world system that affects all aspects of society. Right. Okay, Cristine, you can take over.
Okay, now we are going to bring some examples based on the concepts and ideas and practices of quilombism, the conception of land, and the mangrove metaphors. So we illustrated the analytic value of Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies in Global South applied linguistics by considering quilombism, the land, and the mangrove metaphors. We situated the ontology of language on land and on the mangrove. Believe that this is important because land, with all of the multiple metaphorical meanings associated with it, in some colonial and post-colonial contexts, has been a site of conflict and self-identification as well. By considering such examples in terms of Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies, we identify a lay-oriented conception of language that includes politics, aesthetics, and ethics, with the objective to denaturalize and de-Westernize universal linguistic cognitive rules about language, second language learning, and applied linguistics. So, what do you understand by quilombo? So the term quilombo is related to the political, juridical, and social cultural struggle of African Brazilians for recognition and citizenship, which is connected to the history of slavery that brought around 5 million African people to Brazil. The term quilombo has evolved and it's related to modes of living, places, resistance, popular movements, and ethical issues in Brazilian context. The concepts of quilombo and quilombismo also are connected to the terms Black, which include two perspectives: the historical experience of Africans who under slavery have been treated as being ahistorical and non-human, and the political and cultural experience of Africans and their descendants toward the creation of a sense of solidarity, community, and belonging. In the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, The use of the expression remanescentes de Quilombo, which means remainders of the Quilombo's communities, designated a group that has the right to land. Since then, such expression has been broadly used by African Brazilians, scholars, and jurists. So this is the map of Brazil. This is the statistics of slavery, just as an example, if we compare the context of Brazil and the context of the United States. So more than 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil. So this is really the biggest African diaspora outside Africa. And today, an estimated 90 million people, Brazilians, are of African ancestry, according to the last census, which means that more than half of the Brazilian population now identified as Black, Preto, or Pardo, mixed ethnicity. They use these two categories. So, but Brazil also faces the myth of a racial democracy, which is a very violent myth. This myth assumes that the social distance between Black and white people in Brazilian society is the result of class differences and not the outcome of color or racial prejudice. Brazilian society was constructed from the desire to deny racial categorization, since it's seen as a country of mixed races. So, of course, this is a strong ideology. And this is another image of the Quilombos in Brazil. The Quilombo lands, terras quilombolas. A Quilombo is a Brazilian hinterland settlement founded by people of African origin. So in 2003, there was a decree that recognized the Quilombo communities and their claims to the land they inhabited. Quilombola land rights are secured by the Brazilian Supreme Court. So some photos from these communities and their social practice, and of course, language practice. Other examples from their political movements and engagements. What does it mean, quilombismo? Quilombism was a political term used by Abadias do Nascimento, there was a photo there, an African Brazilian writer, activist, and scholar who founded the Teatro Experimental do Negro, the Black Experimental Theater in 1944 in Brazil, and wrote an important manifesto that is called Manifesto of the Black National Convention to the Brazilian Nation. For Nascimento, quilombismo is related to an idea force, a source of energy inspiring models of dynamic organization since the 15th century, which of course still has to be realized. The underlying epistemology of quilombism challenges the Eurocentric theories that helped historically to shape concepts of race, identity, and language used to define and describe Africans' experience in Brazil. So for centuries, we have carried the burden of the crimes and falsities of scientific Eurocentrism, its dogmas imposed upon our being as the branch of a definitive universal truth. This is Abdias Nascimento. So in this, we don't have time to go deep into the discussion, but we argue quilombism works as a framework. And what does it mean? It means to question historical authoritarianism in its several modalities, which of course includes the epistemic one, to problematize the racialized epistemologies that have been used to frame Bantu languages as a language family that was constructed under the 19th century comparative linguistics, to avoid commonplace, dualistic, and simplistic interpretations of power relation related to African experience in diaspora, to avoid the reproduction of language harmonization ideologies, such as the idea of Brazilian Portuguese as product of a harmonious contact between African Bantu languages and European Portuguese, to understand that the language is the product of open-ended and indeterminate process, to expand the meanings of land by considering not only the right to acquire a geographical land, but also symbolic forms of territorialization, such as the idea of language as a dwelling place, and to expand the conception of language in an educational context in which oral tradition and other language practices may be seriously considered. The second example we bring here is the idea of mangrove. In terms of its economic and social aspects, the mangrove is strongly related to the collective harvest of crabs by women in several areas in Brazil. For example, in Bahia, in the state of Bahia, and also in the state of Sergipe, in the state of Santa Catarina. The mangroves are considered complex coastal areas, places of intense biological recycling, a mixture of sea and river, of trees and water, of air and land. It's a kind of biological third space, and metaphorically, we argue that it works as a cultural third space, an ambivalent and indeterminate space in between, where historical meanings are open to negotiation and interpretation. So these are some, of course, examples, and we see also gender issues there. But, like, for example, there is a connection between women's social practice and crab harvesting and environmental issues. The rhythms of the tide and of the harvesting are directly influenced by the moon. By worshipping the local mythical symbolism of Nana, the old lady of the mangrove, these women follow a harvesting ritual that balances environmental and economic exploration. So the mangrove can be seen, that's how we consider, as an in-between metaphor. It's located between the land and the sea, and as an integrated and anti-binary process. The mangrove includes the sea and the land. The mangrove, so according to Ana Delmert, is a form of artistic thinking that reminds us of a collapsing land-bound notions of being in the world, and remind us not to forget the ocean. So the hybrid word mangue-beach, whose symbol is a crab, mixes the ideas of mangrove, rhythm, the beat, and technology. Just as land has been a powerful means to define the several meanings related to territorialization, belonging, and resistance in Quilombism, the word mangue, mangrove, also carries political and critical meanings related to cultural and economic movements of historically subalternized and excluded people in Brazil. The leaders of the movement were Chico Science and Ação Zumbi, Zumbi Nation, who mixed local aesthetic elements such as the African Brazilian rhythm, maracatu, with modern ones such as hip hop and the punk subculture. Oh, sorry. So these are some images from the mangrove. I'm sorry for that, sorry. These are some pictures from the Mangue Beat movement. And such cultural movements also use alternative modes of diffusion, such as social networking, flyers, libraries, street theater groups, and communitarian modes of communication, such as local radio. The multiplicity and complexity of the Mangue Beat movement reflects the integrated and yet indeterminate ecosystem of mangroves, which are, of course, constituted by fluid borders separating and linking diverse elements such as water, roots, mud, crabs, reptiles, and so on. So, inspired by Deleuze and what are his ideas, Delmert proposes a rhizomatic interpretation of the mangrove. Thinking with the rhizome allows us to capture the multiplicities, assemblages, and interconnections that shape the social world and give it meaning. So we argue that such a dialogicity implied in the mangrove metaphor has a deep connection with the way communication, arts, and culture work by approximating, aggregating, resisting, and creating an evolved sensing of political belonging and social struggles. Then, by reconfiguring the regime of visibility and the regime of discourses, which define what can be said and seen by whom, the Mangue movement politically acts by using language as an important element of emancipation. The Mangue movement is an example of how the regime of language politics is also aesthetically configured. So we claim for, of course, new regimes of visibility. Southern perspectives to apply linguistics may help us to recognize language aesthetics and communication by connecting language to its modes of distribution in space and time, helping to create new regimes of visibility. It's not a coincidence that both Nascimento and the Mangue Beat have used the arts, which include the public use of language as a political instrument of self-emancipation. So both Nascimento and the Mangue Beat have used the manifesto as a discursive genre, which signals its political and visual roles. Curiously, the root verb manifest comes from the old French manifeste, which means to make evident to the eye. So the manifesto also can be taken as an example of truth-telling, a way of denouncing regimes of oppression, exclusion, and a search for a new political or artist orientation movements. So Mangue Beat provides opportunities to forge utopian vision of social life. So we go back to Sinfree Makoni now, and then we conclude our presentation.
Okay, thanks, Cristine. Applied linguistics as a discipline cannot escape the charges of epistemological racism, characteristic of westernized universities in which it is practiced. Applied linguistics in the global north, and indeed to some extent even in the geographical south, runs the risk of being permeated by the issues of epistemic racism, of which Western cultural ethnocentrism is one of them, unless it opens up and renders itself susceptible and vulnerable to other ways of knowing and doing applied linguistics, which come from different and diverse cosmovisions. Cristine, we need to move on to the next PowerPoint. Okay. Southern perspectives to applied linguistics. The following are the risks, however, which we have to bear in mind as enumerated by Grossfeld. Can we produce a radical and anti-systemic politics beyond our identity politics? Is it possible to articulate a critical cosmopolitanism beyond nationalism and colonialism? Can we produce knowledge beyond third world and Eurocentric fundamentalisms? Can we overcome the traditional dichotomy between political economy and cultural studies? How can we overcome Eurocentric modernity without throwing away the best of modernity, as many third world fundamentalists tend to do? Our conclusion is that in applied linguistics that draws on Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies is indeed possible and desirable, and can be mobilized for use in the global south, and may indeed serve as a powerful corrective in some areas in the global, in some areas in applied linguistics in the global north as well. Right. Thank you for listening to us. We have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you, Makoni. So some people are interacting there. We still have some 10 minutes more for interaction before we conclude our brief presentation. So some people are saying that the ideology of colonialism is really strong and powerful. So maybe could you comment on how this ideology still reverberates, still works today? So colonialism is not about the past, it's about the present and not about the future. Yes.
That we all are victims of colonization. The difference is the degree and the extent to which we have been colonized. So the issue is, what are you going to do about it? It's not like you can avoid being affected by issues about colonial rule. We all are victims of it. So the question is, what do you want to do about it?
Yes, and there are some political comments here related to Brazilian government and the myth of racial democracy. Maybe you could talk about this ideology of harmonization of languages, and we could think how this ideology of harmonization of languages how does this also how can it also be applied to understand social reality, social practices, and in terms of erasing power relations? I mean, in relation to, yes, maybe this concept of language harmonization. I don't know if you'd like to say something about the ideological aspects of this idea of languages that can be harmonized.
Okay, the idea of language harmonization ontologically works on the assumption that you've got languages which are out there, which are initially discrete entities. So the strategy then is you need to bring those discrete separate entities ontologically together. You need to harmonize them. So what you have done in an argument for harmonization is to theoretically buy into the idea that languages are easily enumerable. They're easily countable out there, so you can bring them together to harmonize them. But if you shift your argument and say that the idea of language harmonization or the idea of language ontologies is where languages are separate beings is just one way of thinking about this, then language harmonization is not necessarily the solution to this particular type of problem, right? Because the sociolinguistically, the phenomenon is already taking place, right? And that there is no pure form of existence. Everything has always been harmonized. Everything has always been creolized. So the argument that me and Cristine make is that it's not like creolization is an exception. Creolization is the norm of all linguistic and social practices.
Yes, perfect. And Makoni, there is a question from Professor Daniel Carvalho from Federal University of Bahia. He makes a comparison between the mangue metaphor, mangrove metaphor, and what is being called in Brazil epistemologies da laje, that can be translated as favelas rooftop epistemology. So his question is if we can try to compare both metaphors in terms of this idea of instability or indeterminacy. So I think so, yes, I think we can compare, but we should consider that contextualize the social practices. So we are talking about different social practices when you talk about the metaphor of the mangue or mangrove, and when you talk about the metaphor of epistemologia da laje or favelas roof top epistemology. I don't know if you'd like to say something
yes,
about that.
I think my take on this is as follows, is that it's important, I think, for us to pay attention to the metaphors that we use when talking about language. And if, for example, the rooftop favelas, etc., if they work, that is true. But you should always be aware that any metaphor can only work so far, right? That there will always be some areas where you realize that either you've pushed it too far or that it is not able to it can't function effectively. What I am skeptical of, however, is the idea that there are metaphors that are applicable across the board, right? We should always find ways, I think, of being able to limit the extent to which our metaphors are applicable. One of the problems that contemporary linguistics has always faced is the assumption that what is true in one context is necessarily true elsewhere. Yeah.
Yes, perfect. There is another question here from Professor Kleber from University of Brasília, in Brazil, Kleber Aparecido Silva. So how can we implement in our academic and scientific locus what we have been defending from the principles of critical applied linguistics? How can our Southern voices be echoed more forcefully in the educational and linguistic policies that are implemented in our countries, and especially in Brazil, which invisibilizes Black and indigenous peoples? So how can we connect this critical perspective with educational scenario? So I would say that we have to consider what counts as education. What does it mean when you are talking about education and educational language policies? So do languages, for example, need to be systematized previously to be taught? So what does it mean when we talk about the meanings of education and the meanings of learning and teaching? So how do people learn? So then I think there is this connection with the lay-oriented perspective when we consider how the experience of learning may work, how individual experience of learning is differs from person to person. I don't know, Makoni, would you like to mention something related to this?
Yeah. I think Adrian will have to jump in here. To me, the issue is one of lay perspectives, but how lay perspectives are then related to notions of local knowledge, right? And let me give you an example of where I think lay perspectives might be helpful. If you're talking about the construction or invention of languages, et cetera, and all that, where the emphasis was largely on the role of missionaries, etc. The issue of lay perspectives becomes liberatory because you are then saying anybody else who knows or is associated with that language, their input to the formation of that language is a valuable thing to do. But if you didn't have that argument about a lay perspective, it would be difficult for you to make that case, right? So if you, for example, you have some of the Southern African languages which are produced by missionaries, and if you are unhappy with the way they were constructed, the idea of a lay perspective from integrationism helps you because you can then say, okay, I mean, anybody is an expert in the language that they use. So you can then be able to use that particular type of language as well. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. And there are many people interacting with us here on the chat on YouTube. Thank you very much to everyone who is there following the discussion. So Johan, who is also going to present a conference in the event, he makes a comment and a question. So about the rhizomatic, does it not suggest a network that covers everything without deep rootedness, a kind of generalized indifference, the perfect metaphor of a global order? Or the mangrove is really a wonderful metaphor, but it seems to be much more powerful than the rhizome. Yes, and it's interesting to also consider what we understand by rootedness and belonging. So what is the meaning of belonging? I agree with Johan that the mangrove seems to be much more powerful than the rhizome in relation to how it can make us think and reflect about local social practice, and also how language is working there, how language is also a product of this local social praxis. Of course, there are power relations there, underlined. There are power relations there that are covered by this concept of mangrove. So I don't know, would you like to mention something, Makoni, about this idea, this relation between the metaphor of the mangrove and the idea of rootedness?
Yeah, the idea of rootedness is one of the many metaphors that you get in language. But what you are interested in is how you can balance notions of rootedness with notions of, let's say, permeability and flexibility, so that you are able to, on the one hand, talk of language or social rootedness, and while at the same time talk about language flexibility. The general tendency has been largely because of the translingual movement, polylingualism and plurilingualism, to talk about the fluidity and mobility. But to such an extent that is overlooked partial notions of rootedness. And to some extent, what you have here is an interesting Eurocentric view of the world in terms of, let's say, aspects about translanguaging and superdiversity, where the mobility that is talked about is largely the mobility of people going to the global north. But rarely do you find any discussions about the people coming from the north to the south, right? And what I think we need to do in these southern epistemologies is to be able to hold two different concepts which might be in tension simultaneously. In this case, rootedness and flexibility together, because language, whatever it is, includes both elements. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Makoni. We still have some more 10 minutes, so I'm going to read some comments and questions. Andrea, she says, oh, this was very interesting. If there is time, could you talk more about this notion of Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies serving as a powerful corrective in applied linguistics of the global north? Rosemary, she says, thank you for your paper. We all agree that from perspective of Southern global epistemologies, much needs to be discarded. She also says, I would be interested to hear your opinion on what we could or should retain in our disciplines. And Valeria Minakova, she asks, could it be that the northern and southern ideologies of language sometimes coincide? Do we necessarily have to oppose them to each other? I'm asking this because in my research site, that can be categorized as global south, northern ideologies are pretty much prevalent. So there is this question, yes, between, there's not a binary.
It's not a binary, yeah.
Global and north,
yeah,
it's much more dynamic and evolving and complex, yes.
Yeah. It's not a binary thing. This is not geography being equal to epistemology, right? You can have southern epistemologies in Detroit, in Philadelphia. You can have people doing northern epistemological work in the south, in let's say in Durban, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, etc., whatever. It's not a question of geography being equivalent to epistemology, right? It's a question of the philosophical orientation that is being being adopted. And you can have southern perspectives even in the northern parts of Europe, right? So it's a question of you being sensitive enough to understand the underlying assumptions and philosophical orientations which form the basis of your own work.
Yes, and it's also interesting to point that it's not a new perspective. Like when we talk about Southern perspectives, these are really like even pre-colonial perspectives and experiences. It's not something new that is being invented now. So it's just about how we can listen to other voices. How can we frame other experiences? How can we bring together other experiences that historically have been erased? Silenced? Yes, I think we still have some other comments, and then we can go to the end of our conference. Makoni has an appointment the next 10 minutes. So Silvanir is saying it's important, this discussion about colonialism. And there's also some reference to the colonization of higher education and how universities have to face this challenge of decolonizing itself. So Vinicius, good to see you and hear you again, Professor Makoni, thanks a lot. Hisla Hamali saying this perspective that we are all victims of colonialism in different degrees is amazing and important today. And there is also Vanessa who is mentioning Paulo Freire. Yes. Maybe
I think the most important thing is to just realize that we are all victims of colonization. It's a question of the degree, and like what Minolo would put it, so what are you going to do about it? And on the issue about decolonizing the universities is that I'm pretty sensitive to the idea that it is a difficult process to engage in. But universities are funny species. They normally they also create certain spaces in which certain decolonial debates can take place. All right. For example, this particular type of debate that we are talking about is an example of some space being open to discussions about decoloniality, even in universities that in other cases resist the whole idea of decoloniality. Yeah.
Yes, and since we are talking about language, it's also important to consider how can we narrate those invisible experiences, those silent experiences. In which language are we going to talk about, to write, to speak about these narratives, these metaphors, and these local experiences? So how also the languages we use to frame those local experiences, this language is also under revision, and I mean, is also on the debate. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, do you have some final words before we finish, Makoni?
I think this is fine. I think the issue for me is that the project that we are all engaged in now requires us to philosophically listen to as many different voices as possible, and to avoid, for example, what Lewis Gordon was talking about the other day, what he calls disciplinary decadence. That is the belief that it is your discipline that has got access and keys to the future, right? That you need to listen to other voices, and that there's no single discipline that has got a monopoly on what reality is all about.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's time to finish. Before we finish, I'd like to remind everyone to visit the channel on the YouTube and check the future talks and conferences. There are several fascinating critical discussions on integrationism and language ideologies and Southern perspectives. So we invite you to interact with those people who are going to present the next works and roundtables. So thank you very much, Professor Makoni.
Okay, thank you very much, Cristine. I will join you later on. Let me rush off to another.